Namaskar, good evening. The who's who of global world politics converged at Hiroshima for the G7 summit. A multitude of statements were issued by each party. However, two particular statements, one by the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, as well as the second by the Indian Prime Minister, made headlines. Namaskar, welcome to this special presentation. I am Bhuvan Apurva Jha for Study IQ. As in this presentation, we will take a look at the two statements made by the United Nations Secretary General as well as the Indian Prime Minister. The topic being reforms of the United Nations Security Council. We will also seek to understand the history of reforms of the United Nations Security Council. What is the origin of this conflict? Thereafter, we'll take a look at the different perspectives associated with the different stakeholders involved in this process. And finally, we'll also assess India's candidacy as it aspires to get a seat at the big table. First up, let's straight up dive in and understand the statement made by United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Now he says that it's time to reform Security Council and Bretton Woods. In fact, he's saying that, there was a growing consciousness among developing countries that not enough was being done to remove the frustrations of the global south. A direct statement and an admission that the current structure, the current hierarchy, is not fulfilling the aspirations of a large majority of people, especially of the people in the global south. Now, this was followed by a statement by the Indian Prime Minister, who said, speaking about the United Nations, he says, why does the United Nations fail to prevent conflicts? Why can't it even agree on a simple definition as that of terrorism? The Prime Minister saying that the institutions created in the last century are not in line with the system of the 21st century, that there is a mismatch in what is expected and what is happening. And finally, the Prime Minister ending that if the reforms are not introduced, the United Nations and Security Council run the risk of just being reduced to a mere talk shop. All chatter and no action is what the Prime Minister is accusing the United Nations and more specifically the United Nations Security Council of. So, we'll first examine the root cause of this issue and we'll take you back to history. First in 1945. When the Charter was being set up, United Nations had 51 members and the Charter stipulated that, you'll have 5 permanent members. The 5 permanent members being United States, the United Kingdom, France, Soviet Union and China. Thereafter, 6 elected non-permanent members were also designated in 1945. Now, therein lies the problem. At the very outset, a demarcation has been made, a sort of hierarchy has been put forward between permanent members and non-permanent members. Thereafter, the selection of the elected members, the non-permanent members, how was that to be done? The role and maintenance of international peace as well as geographical location was to be ensured. Coming back, now the Oppenheim's international law. So how were these P5, the Great 5, the permanent 5 of the UNSC elected? What was the rationale behind their choosing? It was essentially that their importance in the aftermath of World War II, which were the major players, and that it was fixed finally that the major players were United States, United Kingdom, France, Soviet Union and China. Now bear in mind that this is the time when we're talking about is just after World War II. The nations therein were of a completely different mixture. The standing was different than it is today. Close to 100 years will be passing soon since the formation of the United Nations, and yet there have been no fundamental changes in the way it is set up. This essentially is the problem. The lacuna starts from 1945, like I told you, when this hierarchy was proposed. Moving forward, and then the milestone arrives is 1965. Now the United Nations has grown to 117 states from 51. And then they adopt the resolution number 1991, which essentially increases the number of non-elected members. But nothing changes for the P5. No changes therein. And since then, there has been no changes allowed, no charter. The charter does not allow for any changes. The last change being in 1965. Finally, the question of equitable representation and increase in the membership of the Security Council comes up in 1979. Close to almost 40 years have passed and yet nothing has happened. Why? Well, because the forum is essentially a forum for only speeches but no negotiation. Nothing. All you do is yap yap, but no tangible outcome coming out of that yap yap. So, when you go forward, you realize that in 2007, finally, the intergovernmental negotiations were started. Alright? And the United Nations Reforms was unanimously launched in 2007. Now, what was it to consider? Well, 5 questions. Number 1, the categorization of the membership. Like I told you, the permanent 5, the non-elected members. How was it to be going forward? What were the changes? Number 2, the question of veto. That the permanent 5 had the power of veto was essentially a primary question that needed to be addressed. Should such countries be given veto? After all, aren't all countries equal? Aren't all men and women equal? So why should you have one country over the other? That was also to be taken up. Finally, the question of regional representation, size and working, and the interrelationship with the General Assembly, all of them were to be considered. More specifically, of importance is the regional representation. In the P5, you have almost 3 European powers, 1 Asian power, none from Africa, none from Latin America. How fair and inclusive is that body is the primary question that they were supposed to debate. In fact, in 2015, 120 members of the United Nations gave written submissions asking for negotiations for a process to begin to answer these questions. However, as expected, the P5 stymied those efforts. Who was leading those efforts? Well, China. So, with that kind of closed-door reference when it comes to the question of reforms, now going forward, we have to understand what was lacking in that process, that intergovernmental negotiations that began, well, as the President of the United Nations General Assembly, Ambassador Saba Korosi of the Hungary, how he puts it, well, it's a process that has no text, no procedure, and no timeline. Essentially, just diluting the whole purpose of the process, which was followed up with a beautiful statement by the External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar, who says that there is no record keeping that allows progress to be measured. There are no minutes of the meeting, only speeches is what happens. And in fact, he goes on further to add that not just that, there are suggestions that negotiations start when consensus is achieved. Imagine that. How can you negotiate after the consensus? Don't you have first negotiations and then you come towards consensus? Essentially, the foreign minister putting it as a system of putting the cart before the horse. Strong statements coming from the External Affairs Minister. Going forward, so now the question of reforms. How are reforms to be done and why are reforms important? Well, how should you do it? What's the procedure laid down in the United Nations Charter? Agreement of at least 2/3 of the member state to be ratified by 2/3 of the states. Also, all the permanent members of the UNSC must compulsorily agree to those amendments. Now, why should it change? Well, like I told you, the Security Council's membership does not represent the aspirations of a 21st century. It is an organization that is rooted in its post-World War origins and has not changed with time. It fails to understand that countries have evolved, that civilizations have come forth, and some countries that had the standing post 1945 are now struggling and yet maintain a place on the P5. At the same time, questions were also raised on the veto, as veto basically hamstrings the Security Council as a problem-solving body, as a body that can assure and offer accountability. There is no accountability. Why? We'll see going forward in the video, as P5 members have regularly misused the power of veto for their own narrow ends. Now, going forward, so the problem of membership first. Let's consider that for a moment. Now, if you look at the whole membership across the spectrum of United Nations, especially for the P5, well, it's dominated by the Western great powers, whereas as expected, the Global South and smaller states are marginalized. No representation, lack of representation is a major charge that is made at the United Nations Security Council. There are no permanent members, like I told you, from Latin America, and China is the only Asian member. Now bear in mind that most of the peacekeeping missions that the United Nations undertakes, well, that is often targeted at the Global South, in countries that would comprise the Global South. However, the dichotomy of the situation, well, the Global South has no voice, no say in the way these peacekeeping operations are run, for the high and mighty, the P5, will be the final arbitrators of that decision. So, finally a proposal was put forth that should the UNSC be reformed, who would be the likely contenders? Which among the rest of the countries, 193, close to 193 United Nations members, who are the likely replacements or the likely additions to UNSC? A host of names came up. Brazil, Mexico, from Africa, Nigeria, South Africa and Egypt, from Asia Pacific, India, Japan and Indonesia. From Eastern Europe, you had Poland and Ukraine staking their claims, whereas from Western Europe, Germany put its name forward. All nations that have a lot of credibility, that have done well for themselves in their limited realm, and are well within their rights to stake a claim for a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. All of them, in fact, unanimously calling for reforms since long. Now, when we go forward, we quickly understand the counter-arguments to the claims made by these countries now. Now, it essentially boils down to this simple question, that regional representation versus finding suitable candidates is how the P5 puts it. Now, how and what are the suitable candidates? Who is to decide that? So, you have certain rankings. The Freedom House's democracy rankings, which lists that only 5 of the names that have been proposed in the previous slide, well, most of them do not qualify as free democracies. So Brazil, South Africa, Japan, Poland and Germany are classified as fully free democracies. The rest are surprisingly not. At the same time, Human Freedom Index puts Brazil and South Africa slightly above the median. So the question now arises, especially when you take in the context of, say, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, the Chinese misdemeanors against the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, with its n number of neighbors across its borders. Can the United Nations Security Council afford countries with such checkered backgrounds, with such checkered pasts? The counter-argument to that, well, most of the current claimants, the current members of P5 have some sort of human rights issues within their own territories, their own borders. No country, after all, is perfect. So why should you deny the claim of these other countries just on these particular facets, on these particular issues? So that's what the primary issue of this P5 was. That's what their primary rebuttal was. That adding countries with weaker records on democracy or human rights, well, you are going to add to the issues that China and Russia have brought forward for the UNSC. At the same time, one has to consider the intra-regional factors. What are the intra-regional factors? Well, if India gets in as a seat at the P5 as part of the reformed P5, what is exactly going to happen? You are not going to have, say, Pakistan, who is going to take lightly to it. China will most likely oppose it. these intra-regional factors will probably exacerbate the situation. So how does one go about treating this? How do you cure the cancer at this particular moment? Well, that is it. The primary issue is that of the veto. The veto power, as I told you, has been misused by almost every country that comprises the P5 for their narrow ends, for their narrow ideologies. Indeed, it has often said that the P5's ability to block any measure fundamentally cripples the workings of the United Nations Security Council. For example, Russia blocked all condemnation of its invasion of Ukraine. China, like I told you, has blocked multiple resolutions for its misdemeanors in Uyghur, against the Uyghurs, against the Tibetans, against its neighbors. At the same time, Kremlin also objects to adding Germany. They don't see eye to eye. The UK, France and the United States bring up these notions of freedom and democracy to take back any claims that is made by any other country across the world. So, one proposal that was put forward was that the United Nations General Assembly should vote on a particular issue and they can override the veto of the P5 by one member of the P5 or all of them. After all, if every country is equal, every country's voice must be heard equally. However, like I told you, the intergovernmental negotiation process so far has come to naught. There has been no progress, none made so far. Why? Because it's a forum for empty speeches and no tangible action. Going forward, so we assess India's candidacy. But before that, India's candidacy is essentially based on reformed multilateralism. What exactly is reformed multilateralism, you might ask? Well, as it's considered directly opposite to reinvigorated multilateralism, which is essentially the position taken by the other countries, who are essentially saying that there is no point to fix what is not broken. Let's just reinvigorate the current institutions with the current people or the institutions or the current countries in place. There is no need to expand the P5, they might say. There is no need to expand the number of non-elected members is also a counter-argument. India debates that and says, no, that's not going to work. We need reformed multilateralism so that these institutions are able to do justice to the aspirations of the countries, of different countries across the globe according to the needs and realities of the 21st century. That has been India's position, most recently in fact, put forth in the G23 Foreign Ministers meeting in 2023 March. Now, what are the basic tenets of India's candidacy? Number one, India wants to be seen as a moralistic force with a robust, vibrant culture of democracy. This has been the case. India is the largest democracy, a fully functional democracy, contrary to whatever such particular polls might say, which is why that is its strongest claim. That it holds 1.4 billion people amongst its territories is a massive push in that direction. How can you leave out such a huge voice, majority of the world population, on some arbitrary decision? At the same time, India has an illustrious record of serving with United Nations, not just the peacekeeping forces, but across a variety of realms. India has taken the lead at a number of times. At the same time, India is the fastest growing economy. It's a country that's on the move. It's a country now that's getting its due recognition. How long can the reforms be denied to India? One cannot delay the inevitable just because the P5 have the veto at their hands. It's not how the world multilateralism works. With that now, we come to the question, is the United Nations outdated, dysfunctional and unfair? Indeed, in fact, if the United Nations has to go forward, it needs to learn from the failings of the League of Nations. Well, amongst the many reasons why League of Nations failed, one can often attribute it to it not being inclusive enough, to it relying on inaction, two charges that can be made against the United Nations in 2023. It has failed miserably on many counts, and it continues to do so only because it refuses to act, because it refuses to not kowtow to the whims and fancies of the P5. This is where I leave you, my dear viewers, but before I do, please look at this question, especially from the mains perspective. For the continued existence and relevance of the United Nations, it is necessary to ensure that it represents as possible the reality of the power equation of the 21st century world, that it cannot afford to not change. Because if it doesn't, it does risk becoming another League of Nations. If you did like this video, please do let me know in the comment box below. Till I see you tomorrow, 9 p.m. with another topic on which we discuss the India perspective. This is Bhuvan Apurva Jha signing off for Study.